And thinking back over that in anticipation of this interview, I have mostly landed with a sense of kind of coming home with WCCI, that I have come at these concepts about ACEs and resiliency kind of through my whole adult life and from different directions. And before there was this clear a paradigm for the concepts, and that it is really lovely for me right now to feel like I'm not struggling to kind of figure out how I'm going to take a path that fits my values in the face of a lot of other people who see things differently. And certainly it's not like the whole world shares WCCI's views either, but there's so much more of a community now that it's really, you know, kind of like people used to use that phrase of a safe place to fall or a safe place to land. I feel like I have my home community with our group and the bigger movement. So I wound up with just a lot of gratitude and a lot of appreciation for where we are and what we're doing right now, and all of you who are involved in this.
And Suzi, you had mentioned that a time or two ago in one of our conversations, and I don't know if we've talked about this, but my mom's a therapist in Virginia. And so I was talking to her about those comments that you made, and that really resonated with her as well. She said she remembers back to a time when the primary focus wasn't billing and, you know, short-term, brief intervention kinds of things. And back when you thought more about family dynamics and long-term history and trauma. And so I told myself if I got to mention that to you, that we had that conversation, and that resonated with her quite a bit as well.
Yeah, I think I'm old enough that when I was in college, it was right in the middle of the second wave of the women's movement in the 1970s, and where there was a lot of conversation and activity, and we were also in the later stages of the civil rights movement of the 60s, of the 50s and 60s. So there was still a lot of that awareness around that was mixing and intermingling, and sometimes not mixing so well with some of the women's movement ideas. Folks in both arenas where it didn't overlap, that were trying to make people pick one or the other. For African American women, I remember conversations around that. So there were some real difficult times with that, but it was also a very exciting time because there was so much that had not been talked about before that was being talked about. And that was sort of a theme of my life growing up, that until I got involved in training for a new peer counseling program on campus my junior year of college, I had not realized how much my family did not have language for anything real and personal. So I have an ACES score of like a 0.5. There was no overt trauma, but I am the child of parents who grew up in the Depression with a huge amount of trauma, and their parents grew up with even more trauma and distress. So I got that subsequent generation leftover stuff, the transgenerational impact of all of that. So even though my parents did really well with not carrying on the more overt dramatic components of their family legacy, for which I am very grateful, there was a lot of disconnection. They had managed a lot of their issues by changing the subject, not talking about it, checking out. My mother's stuff was the find the silver lining, look on the bright side, lots of those cliche things that drove me absolutely crazy as a child, who had a lot of strong emotions. And where there was no place for them, there was no language for them. So I also learned early to take them away to my bedroom until I could learn how to just not have them and how to repress them. And so by the time I was in college, I really and truly thought I didn't get angry. And I really and truly thought I didn't get scared. I just knew there were some things I didn't like and preferred not to do. And that was it. That was the limit of my vocabulary. And then I got into this training because of my involvement in some campus ministry activities. It was a co-sponsor of this new peer counseling center, which was a really kind of new thing in the country at that point in time. And the training was extensive. It was like, I don't know, 40 or 50 hours of really experiential role plays and learning about conflict resolution, assertiveness, communication, self-calming, all kinds of really healthy things. And I remember frequently thinking and saying, oh my gosh, there are words for this. Oh my gosh, I never knew you could actually say this stuff out loud. Oh my gosh, I didn't know that you could resolve a conflict this way, that you could address a conflict, that you could do something other than just pretending it didn't happen. And it was really transformative for me to learn how to do that, and in the process of learning, be part of a group of folks where we were immersed in that together. And so we were all reinforcing those skills with each other and then using them with clients and helping other people with the same sort of enlightenment that a lot of us were dealing with. And so that was the beginning, I think, of my journey into this world. And fairly close on the heels of that, I got involved as a volunteer again with the local mental health crisis line, which at the time was staffed by all volunteers with the mental health paid staff as backup. But we got amazing training, and we got invited to professional conferences and workshops for therapists. And most of that was very client-centered, humanistic, oriented, very what we would now call integrative health, a lot of body-mind work, a lot of just assumption that holistic was the way to go because it was the early 70s. And some of that was a little out there, but it was very powerful in looking at the ways that could transfer to my life and to just normal people's lives and not just a weird therapy group setting. So that was kind of my foundation there as I was moving into professionally. Wound up working for a group that was formed with a bunch of volunteers with the Durham Women's Health Collective. The Campus Counseling Center was focused on sexuality and relationships, because again, that was a time when nobody talked about sex out in public, and most people didn't talk about it at all. And if you had sex, you just did it, but you didn't talk about it. And all of a sudden, Roe v. Wade happened, and there were going to be abortion clinics opening up, and nobody could even talk about contraception or dating or sexuality. And so this was our campus's response to that, was how to open up those conversations, offer people information and models for conversation and awareness of one's own body, awareness of how sexual relationships worked, how to make choices and figure out your own values and make choices consistent with your values, all that kind of stuff. And it was huge because it had all been so taboo culturally before that. Obviously, some people were talking about it, but most people didn't have accurate information. It was so different from today, where information is available everywhere. And of course, there was no internet. The Boston Women's Health Collective book, Our Bodies, Ourselves, was just like radical and revolutionary because it had basic information about reproductive health and contraception. There's nothing in it that we would think of as weird or unusual today, but back then it was like it was banned in a lot of places, but it was huge. And the Crisis Center had a women's group that was working on similar stuff and got together with some of our college group volunteers and formed a community collective called the Durham Women's Health Collective that was modeled on the Boston Women's Health Collective and the Berkeley Women's Health Collective. And so that was where I learned a lot about community organizing and networking and collaborative work. And we networked with local physicians and nurses and the med schools at Duke and UNC. We had an office where we did a lot of counseling on women's health issues. We did a lot of education. We worked with the health department. We went into schools and did sexuality education because the teachers didn't want to be thought of as somebody who could say those words out loud. So that was interesting. And the health department staff didn't particularly want to do it either because they didn't want to get that label as people who could talk about sex. So we were like, okay, you know, we'll figure this out and do it. But it was really exciting. It was a huge amount of work. We all joked that we should all just move in together because we spent so much time together outside of our day jobs. And then I wound up being able to get a paid job coordinating the umbrella group under which the health collective worked for a couple of years at the YWCA in Durham as part of the Women's Center there. So I wound up coordinating that whole thing and doing a lot of volunteer management, but really learning so much about volunteer organizations and that community networking and the changes that were possible. We really changed healthcare delivery in the Durham Chapel Hill area in significant ways that we would hear about later from med students that we taught, who later, you know, were doctors in the community who would give us that feedback of, I remember when you came in and, you know, did this with our med school class. So it was really empowering, and especially for most of us being not very long out of college and feeling like we were just sort of trying to figure out life in the adult world.
And Suzi, I guess you'll probably come back to this, but what you were saying about giving people words to identify their emotions and express them, that's such a huge component of what we're doing now in the trauma-informed care, especially in schools, trying to teach kids how to identify emotions and regulate emotions and name them. And so when you come back around to resilience, are you going to talk more about that?
Yeah, and I can just talk about that now. I mean, at that point in time, what we were doing was very much about empowerment and of women to learn more about themselves, to learn more about their own bodies, because that information was not so easily available and the docs didn't know. Part of the reason we went into those teaching programs was that we had nurses and some doctors' wives in our group who had been looking at the textbooks and talking to faculty in the med schools about how things were taught, and it was horrible. And so they learned about like tumors on ovaries and that sort of stuff, but nobody knew anything about just normal women's health care, and they were all men. and almost all the med students were men. So it was this totally male world who thought they knew stuff about women's bodies, but they would be trying to medicate women for having a cycle that wasn't a 28-day textbook regular cycle, because all the books said that's what it was supposed to be. I mean, there were just tons of examples of you know, some things that were bizarre that way, and other things that were pretty horrific, like they learned to do pelvic exams on women who were anesthetized for other surgeries, and sometimes got consent and very often did not. And so they learned how to do pelvic exams on basically sort of almost corpses, and until we went in and changed that. So there were all kinds of things that women didn't know and that the medical community didn't know. And as we made those changes and women were able to be more assertive and ask for what they wanted, and the docs got over themselves and realized that was a good thing, then healthcare worked much better all the way around. And it really, like I said, it really made a big difference that way. We also, in the community education groups and meetings and workshops that we held, learned a lot from women who were involved in various kinds of alternative practices. There was you know, we were in Chapel Hill, Durham area, so there was, of course, a lot of alternative stuff, as there still is there. So there were people beginning to get into acupuncture and acupressure and herbal medicines and things like that. And some people that were doing things that were, you know, of concern, but many people who were talking about, you know, the regular medical care didn't help with this or that. And I learned about this in a workshop in, you know, New York or someplace, and tried it, and oh my gosh, I finally am, you know, this thing is fixed, this thing is healed. And so we all began, and even things like nutrition. Nobody was talking about nutrition as a component of health. Can you imagine? It wasn't part of the picture. And a lot of the women's health movement was beginning to look more at what we were and were not being told about the food we ate, and learning how we could adjust what we ate to stop getting yeast infections, to you know, shift our exhaustion levels, to take better care of ourselves. So that level of self-care was around. There was not so much awareness then about grounding exercises and breathing exercises, that sort of stuff in the mainstream. That was considered more kind of part of yoga maybe, but not something to apply to everyday life. That came later.
And so was there a specific technique or program or intervention that y'all used to try to help people find their voice, or was it kind of an individually based, working with each, you know, person individual? How did y'all, what technique did you use to help people find a voice?
It really depended on the situation, Denise. We were in that situation, and then a couple of years later, I wound up working with a substance abuse education program, which was also very much about life skills and empowerment and understanding yourself in healthy ways and taking care of yourself, rather than here's what this kind of drug looks like and don't do it. The research was all pointing to, at that point, we actually had some really good research. NIDA was doing really good research, showing that people were less likely to get into trouble with substance abuse if they could communicate well, if they had healthy relationships and knew what that was, if they had the words to use for resolving conflict and being assertive, not aggressive, but assertive, listening to each other, that sort of, those basic skills that were also part of the health and sexuality relationship work I was doing before. By that time, we were beginning to understand the role of aerobic exercise, early work on that was beginning to be more accepted, and some sense of breathing techniques were beginning to move in. But mostly what we were doing was encouraging those communication skills and relationship skills, and self-awareness, self-understanding, and sort of, I guess, expanding the vocabulary for how to talk about that, and encouraging women to realize they had a right to even think that way, that they didn't have to just focus on everybody else and take care of everybody else, which had been the cultural norm, you know, kind of going into some of those times, a lot of how women had been raised. So a lot of that, you have a right to have an opinion, and then helping women in workshops or groups, or sometimes individually in the peer counseling, to learn ways of slowing down and even beginning to just ask themselves those questions about, well, you know, how do you feel when you think about doing this instead of that? What happens inside you? We didn't know to call it a body scan then, but some of that was going on. Check inside. How does this land when you imagine doing this, when you imagine doing that? So it was less defined, it was less organized, that piece of it, but it was there.
And you've mentioned self-care a couple of times, and we have a lot of conversations about that in trauma work as well. And so I know the pushback that I so often hear is, I don't have time for that. I don't, you know, that's too expensive. I have too many things to do. And I know you're not just a proponent of that in your practice, but also personally as well. And so either now, or if you want to come back around to it, we'd love to hear some of the ways that you really incorporate that into your own life.
Yeah, sometimes better than others, and have certainly grown in that over the years as I've learned more about it, for work with clients, as well as just work with friends and with myself. But somewhere in there, I think mostly after I moved up here, after I worked at that substance abuse agency doing all those community programs in life skills and self-awareness and that kind of stuff, the New River Mental Health Center, which was the community mental health center at the time, in end of, yeah, I guess beginning of 1981, they had a mandate to be doing community prevention and education programs, and they didn't have anybody who knew how to do that. And I was really ready to leave Raleigh. I loved my job, but I really didn't like the city. And so I had done some training up here, had come up here for workshops, and just thought, well, you know, why not? So I had a friend who worked at the university who said, well, talk to the director of the mental health center, and he's a friend of mine, and I'll put in a good word for you, and maybe they can work something out. So I just went in with my notebook of outlines and that sort of stuff, and they said, yeah, we need somebody to do exactly this. And so they created a position for me, which was really wonderful, and then turned out to be sort of a mixed blessing. It got very political, but it gave me a chance to move here and to be in this community, but also took me away from support systems and the sense of community with shared values that I had with the people I'd been working with and volunteering with. And it took me a while to figure that out here. And that was where I spent a few years doing community programs, including in the schools, because there weren't very many guidance counselors at the time, and there were almost none in Ashe County, and I was working in Ashe and Watauga. And fairly quickly, I built an outdoor ropes course and group initiatives course as part of that work. I had worked at one in the Chapel Hill area as a volunteer before I moved up here as part of the drug education prevention program there. And so that was a really important place for a lot of people to learn those communication skills and self-awareness skills very quickly. We did the events were sort of like just a way to get at learning how to take care of yourself. And the self-calming breathing techniques actually came very directly for me initially from the ropes course where I first participated, the one where I wound up volunteering in Chapel Hill, because I was terrified of heights. And I didn't know that was going to be part of this event. I just had some friends who'd gotten trained to staff this brand new thing, and that was part of the crisis center that I volunteered at in Durham. And they were just like, hey, do you want to spend a weekend in the woods? And I was like, sure. And that's all I knew. And we got out there, and they started teaching us these basically abdominal breathing techniques, and had us practice that as part of the intro to the program. And we were looking at an event that was about 5 feet off the ground, 4 or 5 feet, and that seemed pushy for me. And then later found out that we also did some stuff that was 12 feet off the ground, and then the second day we did some stuff that was 60 feet up in the air. And of course we were on a safety belay system that was just rock solid, but it was terrifying, and it was not something I ever would have chosen to do. But the staff there was so clear about any of us who got anxious about that stuff, and I was more than anxious, I was like petrified, at just coaching us through that breathing that we had practiced all the way across that 4 or 5 foot beam, and all the way up to the 10, 12 foot high stuff, and all the way across, just like every step of the way. And it was like a religious conversion for me. It was like, oh my gosh, I can do stuff even if I'm scared. I can move through it. I don't have to just not do it. I can actually be scared, manage my physiology, and do it. And that was like besides that it was beautiful woods, and there was a lot of really neat other stuff that happened, but that was the main thing I took away from that weekend. And it changed my life. I was able to recognize all kinds of other places where I had been avoiding things I was scared of, and do the abdominal breathing and figure out whether it was really safe to do or not. Some of our fears are important to honor, but when it was safe and it was just my anxiety, it's like, oh, I can do this. I can control this. I can calm this down and do this thing that I really would like to do, but previously would have just said, I don't think so.
Two things that you mentioned. One is community and isolation. We'll come back to that one. But when you're working with someone who basically is a complete novice to self-care, is constantly on the go and constantly doing for other people, is there a base, an initial thing that you help them develop, an initial first step, or how does that, for those people who are listening who don't practice self-care or wellness at all?
Yeah, so if it's in a group, if I'm doing a workshop or a class, I will offer, usually depending on the length of the group, but if it's a shorter program like an hour or something, I'll usually choose one breathing technique and teach that. And of course people can choose to do it or not, but I'll teach one that most people do find easy to do and usually feel a shift internally from doing if they will try it. And then I will say there's lots of other things like this that if you want to learn them, we can do that. And depending on the length of the program, we might do another one later on. I'll talk some about other components of self-care, talk to people about how to practice that technique and use it, and just leave that as, you know, a taste of what's possible. And then depending on the group and the theme of the group, the discussion about that may go different directions. I will generally talk about, if it's on some kind of stress management and resilience and self-care sort of theme, I'll talk to them about how most people who are busy will run into that issue of, I'm too busy, I don't have time, other people have needs bigger than mine, that sort of thing. And we now, and actually for quite a while, there's been research on the cardio stuff. If you spend a half hour doing something aerobic during the day, the research has been pretty consistently clear that, and the aerobic is that sustained elevated heart rate, where you get your heart rate up and you don't start and stop. That's good for some other athletic stuff. But for mood management, emotional management, anxiety management, that still seems to be a really important thing to do, as close to the 30 to 45 minute range as one can get. But get your heart rate up, keep it up, sustain it for at least 15, 20 minutes. There's still some good effect, ideally 30 to 45 as an eventual goal. If people will do the 30 minutes, they will save an hour and a half in being more efficient. Their brains will work more quickly, they will be clearer, they will have more ideas about how to resolve problems. And that's research from like back in the early 1980s. You know, that's really old. Now we know more about the neurobiology of that, and we know that part of what's going on is a generation within the brain of a set of chemicals that causes the neurons, mostly in the prefrontal cortex, to sprout arms, basically, ready to make new connections in the prefrontal cortex. And so the brain is just primed and ready to go. It's ready to learn. So students do better academically. When we're trying to read professional journals or study things in our work, we will be quicker to learn that information and integrate it. And we will also do a whole lot better job with all the executive functions, because those neurological circuits are just ready to do whatever is needed in the way of those executive functions. That set of chemicals is generated some with any kind of movement, but it is mostly generated from that aerobic activity, that sustained elevated heart rate activity. So we know more about why, but we've known that information for a long time. So I'll almost always talk about that and say, you know, you need to think about that. And you also need to think about the fact that the more tired you are, the more you give without taking care of yourself, the more we know now that your brain downregulates, and the nutrients and the energy and the focus more and more goes to the more reactive parts of the brain, the more primitive circuits in the brain, and less in this part of the brain. So you're just not going to be functioning as well if you don't do the self-care. So if doing your work is important to you, if taking care of those other people is important to you, you're going to do that better if you make these small amounts of investment in your own self-care, so that you can then do those other things.
That makes sense. And so the community isolation, I thought it was interesting you brought that up as something you dealt with 30 years ago, because I think that's, as a community, what we're dealing with now is loss of community, feeling really isolated, and we're all doing things completely differently and have lost our support systems. And so were there things that you incorporated back then to help build that for yourself that you feel like people can apply to what we're dealing with today?
I was running. I was very active physically. I was doing lots of outdoor stuff. The professional connections of running an outdoor program connected me with some regional and national groups that were wonderful, that I networked with a lot. And so, you know, I would take my volunteers from the ropes course to Outward Bound workshops, or to go through their ropes course at the Outward Bound School at Table Rock, or we would, you know, we'd go canoeing together, or that sort of thing. And then in fact, some of the people from that group are still my closest friends from back in the early 80s. And we still do outdoor stuff together, but have for that whole time done a lot of hiking and swimming and, you know, whatever together. So that's been really important. I also, somewhere early on, got involved with a couple of yoga teachers that I did some pretty regular classes with, and then depending on what was going on in my life, that was sometimes more off and on and sometimes more regular, but that was really important. I guess those were the main things. And I was also involved with just some personal friends, exploring some, I guess, more alternative healing modalities, kind of energetic healing and mindfulness practices and guided imagery and meditation, things that were still considered in this up here, considered a little flaky. Connected with alternative practitioners, created some networks, helped co-found a group called Synergy that was all people who were working holistically, complementary alternative providers of various sorts, massage therapists and chiropractors and just, you know, whoever, sharing our work with each other. It's somebody who's an Alexander technique person, and, you know, just all kinds of folks, and learning from each other, and you know, offering sessions and workshops with each other. That was important. And then later that sort of fizzled over time, over the years, and some of us founded Common Ground, which was still sort of new, but it was an intentional blend of mainstream medical providers and psychotherapy providers with more holistic providers. So we had massage therapists and folks like that sharing, and acupuncturists, some other folks sharing ideas with psychotherapists who had not been practicing very holistically, who were very like cognitive behavioral, and what had become a more kind of regimented by the book for some people way of doing psychotherapy, and where the holistic approaches were beginning to be considered a little flaky because you couldn't document how to measure them because they were more holistic and more integrated, and you couldn't research them well. So, and some physicians, we actually had some physicians and a couple of PAs and some other more mainstream folks. And we would have monthly meetings where we would have a theme where we'd all talk about different approaches to working with depression or whatever. So sometimes some of that led to some practices that some of us then were able to incorporate on our own, or people that we wanted to go work with. So it was quite a mix, Denise. I feel like that's a very long answer to kind of a simple question, but it's something that has evolved over the years for me, depending on what I learned about and what was approachable and what seemed like a good fit for me.
And one thing that that's kind of standing out to me is back then you would have had to actually physically go and do all of those things. And now we have this benefit of being able to access so many things online. So yoga
Right.
videos and holistic kinds of things. If you can't go out and find those things, you can usually find that now. Granted, they're not always the most reputable or not the evidence-based practice, but you definitely have access to all kinds of things you never had before. You had one more question, and that is nutrition, because you've mentioned that a few times as well. And I know we could spend an entire hour on nutrition. Are there basic things that you could share with us and just, a short time about you think is a good starting point for somebody who's wondering about nutrition and wellness?
Yeah. I think the most important thing is, unless somebody is in a medical crisis that demands a change in diet that's dramatic, to not do anything dramatic, that to make changes slowly, and to realize that there's not a single plan that's going to work perfectly for everybody. And so, Michael Pollan's statement of eat food, mostly plants, and there's some other part of that, but basically we know that whole foods work better with our bodies than processed food. The more highly processed, the more likely it is that there's going to be something problematic. At best, not as healthy. At worst, maybe toxic. And so the more we can ease our way, if we are eating a lot of processed foods, the more we can ease our way into more whole foods, more simple foods, less and less until no processed foods, and reducing sugar. That really is consistent, except for that little phase where the sugar-based foods, the soft drink industry and the other sugar-based food industries all got together and actually conspired to lie to the public and pay doctors to publish fake research showing that all the problems with health were about fat and not sugar, that was all misinformation. It was total BS. And it's still taking a while for folks to land with saying, actually, most fats are not the problem. Of course, there is excessive fat, and there can be problems with trans fat for sure, but mostly sugar is the problem, and the highly refined carbs, the white flours, the white stuff rather than whole grains. That's almost like sugar, and that the more we can do whole grains and whole foods, the healthier we will be, the less we will kick in all the reactivity that happens in our body when our blood sugar level spikes and all kinds of things don't go well. And if we do that enough, we can contribute to type 2 diabetes. There's other factors as well. But it increases inflammation. It can contribute to brain fog. It can be a whole cascade of stuff if we don't manage gradually, again, cutting back on sugar. And sometimes caffeine. If somebody has issues with anxiety or insomnia, moving that caffeine intake to less and less and earlier in the day can make a big difference, but that's another one to do really gradually. So those are just some basic things. Less meat, but not being rigid unless somebody just feels like that's important to them. Everybody's body is different. Some people do dramatically better on a vegan diet or a vegetarian diet, and some people don't. And so, everybody's got to kind of feel that out for themselves, but realize that if you don't have quite a bit of plant food in the mix, that's not going to be as good for your body. If you're eating almost entirely just like meat and rice or meat and potatoes and desserts, that's not going to work well, because you're going to be missing a lot of important nutrients, and just taking a vitamin pill isn't going to fix that.
And so I really like what you're saying about some things work for some people, not others. And I hear you saying that when it comes to communicating and establishing a network and what to eat. And that is a very important point, I think, to continue to make is no two people are the same. People respond differently to different types of interventions and programs and connections. And so
Right.
I think it goes all the way back to knowing yourself and being able to articulate what you need and be comfortable with that. And so that's just a really important point for us to kind of focus on, is that you have to pay attention to what you yourself need and what works best for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's absolutely true. And as I was working here and transitioned to doing therapy rather than prevention, and got involved on some of the early, again, sort of the early phases in this part of the country of learning about child abuse, the extent to which it occurred, which most of the profession was oblivious to. And that came from Tom starting to work at Grandfather Home for Children, and then having his own memories of abuse triggered by working with kids who were highly abused as children. And so that pushed both of us into feeling like, you know, we really needed to get all the training we could. And I was fortunate to be at New River when they actually had a training budget. And there was a sense of, well, somebody on the staff needs to learn about this stuff. I am personally, as well as professionally, driven to do that so that I could figure out how to help my husband deal with this stuff and how to understand it. So we were just all over the Southeast going to, you know, bunches of trainings and workshops from like the best people in the country, which was an amazing opportunity. Again, just kind of being in the right place at the right time, learning from them as they were learning, because it was still pretty new. This was mid 80s, 86, 87, when that was happening. And that was another place where that theme of there's not a one size fits all was really clear, that there were a lot of different modalities being tried and some of them being shown to work, a lot more self-care modalities that were coming in from certain places and mentors, including, you know, a lot more self-management, self-calming kinds of skills that were fairly new to the field, but many of which are now evidence-based standard skills for working with severe trauma. At the time they were new and seemed a little flaky, but you know, trying them with clients, sometimes saying, you know, this just sounds really weird to me, but this person I really respect just taught it to me in a workshop over the weekend, and they insisted it works for their clients. Do you want to try it? And having my clients come back and say, oh my God, it worked. It was amazing. It totally shifted my nightmares, or, you know, whatever. But, you know, realizing and having all these mentors also say, you know, this works. It's not going to work for everybody. But if your clients will try enough of these different things, they will find the ones that work for them.
And so, Suzi, we've got about 10 minutes, and I've been watching the chat, and I haven't seen anything, but I just want to make sure if anybody has a thought or a question that they'd like to ask you before we get to 1 o'clock hour. I wanted to give people a chance to do that if they'd like. So I pause a minute because people fumble with their mute buttons. The other thing that was really important to me that you said was being gentle with yourself. And so I know, especially for perfectionists and people who are very driven, I can relate to that. And so the idea of not having to be perfect today in your wellness and self-care, but giving yourself some space to make slow, steady adjustments rather than those, you described them as those abrupt kind of changes that may cause a rubber band effect. So just being gentle with yourself.
Yes, that I think is really important. And I know with even in my workshops, I don't tend to teach more than even even in the longer ones, I don't tend to teach more than 2 new techniques for people to go practice. I let them know if they want to learn more, they can get back in touch with me or we can have another workshop. But if people try to do too much at once, they just don't do it. They don't do any of it. So I would rather, with my clients, I will tend to teach one thing, one technique, one strategy per session, have them go home, play with it, come back and tell me what worked and what didn't. Maybe we tweak that one, and then if they did practice with it, I'll teach another one for them to add and practice with. And that way, there's less chance that somebody is going to feel stressed and overwhelmed by, oh my gosh, I should be doing all these things and I'm not doing any of them and I'm paralyzed. Trying to, and particularly working with trauma, our clients didn't have a choice about abuse. They didn't wake up in the morning and want to be victimized. That was completely out of their control. It was not what they wanted. It was certainly not what they chose. And so to have healing and recovery feel forced just replicates the trauma dynamic. People really, I believe really strongly, need to claim choices when there are choices available. When there are times when we just have to do something because there's a crisis of some sort and we have to. But when we don't have to, let's not create more stress and trauma when we're trying to fix the stress and trauma.
Yeah, that's good. Go ahead, Kelly.
I have a question. Thank you, Suzi, for doing this and your words of wisdom. What is your one go-to self-care thing that you do?
The one. I think I do a combination of the main one is breathing and grounding, self-calming, resiliency, like quick resiliency things. And moving, stretching, moving, shifting my body, getting up and walking, just something to shift. And particularly when we're focused on a screen for so many hours a day, that's more and more important. I feel myself, if I don't do that, I feel like I'm sort of collapsing and shrinking. And so I just have to make myself get up and shift gears. So that's important. And then getting outside for me. I mean, I know we evolved with no buildings. We evolved with nature, in nature, and there's just some energetic resonance that there's beginning to be more and more clear research on about the healing that happens when we go just looking at a tree. I know right now I'm looking at a doe and her fawn grazing under our apple tree. So just looking out at nature, and we've watched 3 fawns grow up over the summer, which has been lovely. But getting outside, walking on the grass, being in the garden is super important to me. Those are the daily go-to things. When I can get out on water in a canoe, that's my other main calming place. I just let go of a lot of stuff when I can get in the canoe on a river or a lake.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions or thoughts?
I want to say, I feel like there are so many people on this call who are doing wonderful, amazing work. And Mary, everybody keeps talking about how great your presentation was a few weeks ago. And so there are just lots of people here that I look up to a lot. So
It's the coolest way to spend an hour a week. I love that we've started doing this. Let me just read you a couple things in the chat, Suzi. And so one was, thank you so much for sharing your personal and professional journey with us. Really value and appreciate the work that you do. And then also appreciation for the breadth of experiences and vast knowledge that you possess. Thanks for sharing your wisdom. And then somebody else said, thank you for sharing. Love hearing your story, and a few more thank yous. So Suzi, we got about 4 minutes. If there's anything that you didn't have time to cover that you wanted to leave us with or didn't get a chance to say.
You know, we could go so many different directions with this. One of the things that I know really stood out to me that is from last week that has also been very true to me, that as I came out of a childhood where there was not big T trauma, there was no abuse or addiction or horrible stuff like that going on. It was that lower level norm of general dysfunction. When I began to be exposed to the ways in which people in general, and then finding out it was my own husband as well, were coming out of just horrible violent situations. Initially, I really had some existential crisis stuff going on. I remember a moment where I just crashed and called my best friend, and I was just sobbing. I had had a cancellation. I was at the mental health center in my office, and I just was sobbing on the phone saying, I don't want to be here. I don't want to be on a planet where people do this to each other. This is so awful. I just don't want to be around anymore. I don't want any part of it. I wasn't like actively suicidal, but I was so overwhelmed. And then where I moved to, as I got more training and experience in those early phases of how to begin to work more effectively with trauma survivors, and even some pretty horrific, wound up doing like torture survivors and, you know, organized crime, brainwashing, torture kinds of trying to split people into multiple personality stuff, really just worse than the worst nightmare kind of levels of trauma that I just wound up working with. What I realized was that if I was grounded and I was clear that all of the ways that we could work with trauma really were miraculous, and not everything was miraculous with everybody, but that people could heal from this horrible stuff. And that if people could heal from that worst possible nightmare level of trauma, that then it was easy as a therapist to backtrack and work with lighter levels of problems, not in a dismissive way, because they're very real and painful to those of us who are experiencing them, but to have a lot of confidence that we can shift this, we can do this, we can help people make those changes. And that's so wonderful to know that, to discover that, to experience that, you know, on a daily basis sometimes. And that's really powerful.
Well, and it's 1 o'clock, and I think that's a perfect way to end. Your statement that people can heal from horrible things, I think really gives us a whole lot of hope and motivation and, you know, forward-looking perspective. So I think that's a perfect way to end. And several more thank yous in the chat. So thank you for spending time with us today, Suzi, and sharing all these experiences with us. And we hope you have a great rest of the day. Everybody, thanks for being with us, and hope to see you next week.
Thanks everybody for being here. Thank you, Denise.
Thanks. Have a good day.